latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to the Gist on Strat News Global. Good evening, I'm Surya Gangadharan and welcome to another edition of the Gist. The rise, fall and rise of Rishi Sunak could well make for a film script one day. But aside from all the usual tropes about an Asian and making it to the top of a very clannish white man's club, I think what is interesting is the fact that Rishi Sunak is largely untested. We have a small graphic for you. His elevation comes at a time when the Ukraine war has triggered political pressures and an economic crisis on London. Sunak is good on finance and economy, and largely untested on some of the other areas of government, including, of course, the political economy, defense, and foreign affairs. So that's what we have of Rishi Sunak. His address to the media outside 10 Downing Street appeared to indicate that he was acutely aware of the challenges before him, and we have a small bite of his from that address to the media, his first outside 10 Downing Street. That's him over there. What he said was, right now our country is facing a profound economic crisis. The aftermath of COVID still lingers. Putin's war on Ukraine has destabilized energy markets and supply chains the world over. So that's, in a nutshell, what he said. Now, joining me from London's International Institute of Strategic Studies is Rahul Roy Chaudhary. He's been on our channel before. He's a fellow for South Asia Defense and Security at the Institute. Welcome, Rahul. Glad to have you.
Thank you, Surya.
Rahul, when Liz Truss was picked for the prime ministership, what prevented the party from choosing him? Because he was already there. He'd been Chancellor of Exchequer. He has a bit of a record as far as finance and economy is concerned. It is better than hers. How come they picked her?
Well, Surya, I think at that time it was a contest for the leadership of the Conservative Party between the two primary contenders, Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, and the procedure for such a contest meant that both the rivals had to sort of be selected by the members of the Conservative Party. So there was a process of selection. In the selection process, by about 170,000 members of the Conservative Party in the UK, Liz Truss got about 81,000 votes, and Rishi Sunak got about 61,000 votes. So there was a clear difference between the two, but Rishi Sunak had done much better than many people thought he would do. Now, once those votes had been counted, she was made the leader of the Conservative Party and then subsequently Prime Minister. In what we've seen in the last few days, it is not a process of selection, but basically I would call it a sort of coronation. That there was no contest for the leadership of the Conservative Party. Rishi Sunak was the only name that had crossed the threshold of 100 members of parliament supporting him, and he was then sort of anointed as the leader of the Conservative Party and the prime minister. So essentially, there were two very different ways of electing the leader of the Conservative Party: the selection process that Liz Truss won, and the so-called coronation process that Rishi Sunak won. But the most important process will be the election process when the Conservative Party, the government will have to go to the polls, and we have about a year and a half, so about 18 months before elections are likely in the UK, most probably in the summer of 2024, at about the same time when India holds its own general elections. That will be the key test for Rishi Sunak, the election aspect of it rather than the selection or the coronation.
And do you think that in these 18 months he can get the economy going, stabilize things, ensure the crisis surrounding prices, living standards is handled?
It's a really tough call for him. I think the main reason he was made the leader. He became leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister was because he seemed to be competent. When there's a huge amount of incompetence going around in the senior ranks of the Conservative, the Tory Party leadership, I mean, the Tory Party has had three prime ministers in 7 weeks, which is unprecedented. So
Yeah.
Rishi Sunak has come to the job on the basis of his competence, on the basis of the impact and the role that he played, an important role as Chancellor of the Exchequer during the COVID crisis, the COVID pandemic crisis in the UK. And I think it's important that we see, and what he is doing is trying to build up support from other sort of constituencies within the Conservative Party. So in addition to the economic focus, there is a political focus. So he has a cabinet now that where people who are close to Boris Johnson and people who are close to Liz Truss have come in. But the economy will be the key focus for him. There is a sort of huge economic crisis in the UK. Energy prices have gone up, interest rates have gone up, food prices have gone up. There's a cost of living crisis. And mortgages are going up, and so people are very worried. So what he's able to do to stabilize the economy will be what people will be looking for in Rishi Sunak as prime minister.
And he could also be the fall guy, in the event things go wrong, he's not able to handle matters. He'll just be dumped and they look for somebody else. That's
So that's
natural.
so I think there is a risk of that, but I think when you look at the Conservative Party sort of leadership, you really see the competence that Rishi Sunak presents. So I would argue that that the Conservatives have this last chance to be able to stabilize the economy in the UK and mobilize the government. Because if they
Our
don't, then
country
all the polls that are taking place now are saying that there'll be a huge, tremendous Labour victory if elections are called in the UK in the next few weeks and months. So I think I would say that he comes into this role as someone who is is competent and who has the potential to make a difference. But we'll have to wait and see if he's able to deliver on those key issues or not.
Some of the reports I read suggest that he is the choice of the fat cat rich guys who actually bankroll the Conservative Party, or the guys who dominate the city of London. They are the people who decided on him, and that went down the chain. Is that how it is? It works.
There is a view that has taken place, but I would seriously doubt it in this case. Remember, I mean, Rishi Sunak, when he was in the context with Liz Truss, got the largest number of support from members of parliament. In this case, in the last few days, he is again was well over 100 supporters as members of parliament who voted, or who were supporting his candidature as the head of as the chief of the Conservative Party. So there is some influence that the City of London wields in terms of the election process. But to have such a wide mandate, I would think it's very difficult to really bring it down to one particular aspect. In fact, there were some people who said that, well, we would never see a British Indian become the prime minister of the United Kingdom, and we've seen that. So there are some concerns about racism in the UK, but clearly in terms of Rishi Sunak, the view was that, well, actually, he is someone who could be good for the Conservative Party and good for the country.
And he was picked by Cameron for the job, wasn't he? I mean, 5-6 years ago, he's a pretty young MP in that sense.
So it's been a phenomenal rise for Rishi Sunak. I mean, I've been looking at the British Indian politicians, Conservative and Labour, for the last nearly 2 decades in the UK, and he came as a surprise. He's been a member of Parliament for only 7 years. Initially, when he made his maiden speech in the House of Commons, he was really seen as India's son-in-law, referring to Narayana Murthy and being his son-in-law and nothing more. But when he became Chancellor of Exchequer, I think that is when people started noticing him much more, and he really made a name for himself. And it is again the point to come back, competence. Compared to the rest of the group, he did a really good job as Chancellor of the Exchequer, and so it is a phenomenal rise for him, and it's hugely exciting for the British Indian community that he is the Prime Minister. And but as you said, I believe there will be a year and a half in which he will have to prove himself before the country goes into the next elections.
But do you think, say, he's able to stabilize matters? I know this is a lot of speculation. A very speculative question. But 18 months down the line, you think the Conservatives would be confident enough, if they have stabilized the economy, to campaign with Rishi Sunak as the face of the party?
So yeah, that is a great question. We just don't have the answer to that at the moment. I think
Yeah.
it will depend on how successful he is. Today, if the UK goes to the polls, I think the Conservatives will have only about 20 seats or something. I mean, they'll be wiped out.
My God.
So they don't want elections now. They
Hmm.
want Rishi Sunak to hold the fort, to improve the economy, for a year and a half, and they'll have elections right at the end. When they have to have elections by. So I would say year and a half in that sense. But remember, there are three different ways. I mentioned, you have the so-called coronation of Rishi Sunak, you have the selection of Liz
Yeah.
Truss, and finally you have elections. And when we go into
True.
elections, possibly by the summer of 2024, the question will be that the Conservative Party will need a leader who will be able to win the election, not
Yeah.
not be a coronation, it will
True.
not be a selection.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
there's no answer to that as yet. I think there are big beasts in the Conservative Party who will play a dominant role. Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister, being one of them.
Yeah.
Remember, he was the
Hmm.
person who won a decisive mandate for the Conservative Party in the 2019 elections. And
True.
it is
Yeah.
possible that the Conservatives
Mhm.
may feel that they need to get Boris back after a sort of hibernation period for him for about a year and a half, 2 years.
Yeah.
But we'll have to see how that works out.
Hmm.
If Rishi is spectacularly successful as Prime Minister, then the idea may be to hold him and continue his role. But it's still unclear as of now. It's still early days, as you said, in that sense.
What does this mean for the British Indian community? They're one of the wealthiest in that country, highly educated, well traveled, prosperous. What does this mean for them?
So, I've talked to several members of the British Indian community in the last few days, and there is, overwhelming support, and there is huge excitement, that
Hmm.
here is a British Indian who has become Prime Minister. And they tell me that, when they came to the UK in the 60s, in the 70s, or later in that sense, there was institutionalized racism, there a tough sort of
Hmm.
challenge. They could not imagine that one of their own could become prime minister. So I think that's the first aspect, that huge excitement that this has happened, and this has happened in their lifetime that they've seen. The second impact has been that is really it's made sort of been seen as a hugely aspirational aspect, that for ethnic minorities in the UK, they can for the first time dream of holding the top post after Rishi Sunak. And this again was never considered to be possible. There was always a glass ceiling, at the level of prime minister. I mean, Rishi Sunak has shattered that glass ceiling. And remember, he comes from a community. The British Indian community is estimated to be about 1.7 million people in the UK, which comprises less
Hmm.
than 2.5% of the population. So it is,
Yeah.
and it's not for the British Indian community, for other ethnic groups. The fact that Rishi Sunak has become prime minister is hugely aspirational for them. I think those are the two big impacts that he's had for the British Indian community.
Which are the other communities that are more larger in terms of numbers as compared to the Indians, Indian origin.
So the British Indian community is the is, I think, well, arguably the second largest in that sense in the UK after the black community. Now remember, the black community, that divisions, whether from Africa, from
Okay.
the Caribbean, etc. But I think variously, the black community is seen as a much larger community than the British Indian community. And then you have the Jewish community, which actually is very small in numbers compared to
Mhm.
1.7 million. I think the figure roughly is about 400,000 or 300,000 in the UK. But they have traditionally
Mhm.
exerted overwhelming influence in British politics, etc., which has not been the case for the British Indian community till
Mhm.
now. And again, one would argue that it's not, the Rishi Sunak. I mean, I think the coronation is more because of his competency than because he represents the British Indian community. But nonetheless, it has really opened up the aspirations for younger people to hold the top spot.
How do you think the average Briton is seeing this? You mentioned earlier that the British Indians are seen as part of the local, population, so that's not the issue. It's the immigrants from India who they don't want. But how
Exactly.
does the average? So yeah.
So I think, essentially the average Briton is worried, Surya, about a 25% increase in the cost of fuel, of heating in the house or the
Mm.
apartment, the 9% to 10% in inflation rate that is going, fuel prices for transportation, education system that sometimes is breaking down, the National Health Service which is overwhelmed and unable to cope effectively, where there are waitings, huge delays for ambulances to come, etc. So I think the average Briton on the street really is saying to himself or herself, it's a mess. I mean, this is really, we've come to a
Mm.
really low position post Brexit and post COVID pandemic, and they want stability. And I really think that they are, if Rishi Sunak is able to deliver, they want economic stability, political stability. If Rishi Sunak is able to deliver, I think the British public will actually be supportive because these are their priorities. It is basic, the cost of living crisis. And remember, we're going to winter now in the next few weeks. It's going to become harder and tougher. And they need someone who can show the
Yeah.
leadership and deliver in mitigating their difficulties.
Yesterday when he was proceeding for his first address to the media outside Downing Street, a lot of heckling going on from the crowds over there. I mean, is this? How do you see this?
So I think there is I mean, in the past, I think we've seen there's been institutionalized racism in the UK.
Yeah.
Immigrants coming in. You look at the life stories, and Rishi Sunak has also a story of his own. He was in a hospital. Sorry, he was in a restaurant with his brother and sister. He was called sort of derogative word, etc. That left an impact on him. So there has been institutionalized racism in the UK. There's no question of it. Today, I think that the situation is different. I'm not saying that racism doesn't exist. Of course, it exists in certain areas, in a certain socioeconomic sort of group, etc. But by and large, there's no institutionalized racism. I mean, it's against the law, it's discriminatory, etc. And so I think for people, it is, Rishi Sunak is seen, of course, by a small group, yes, as a British Indian, and how can he represent a population that is 85% white? But for other people, and I would
Mhm.
argue the majority, he is seen as a competent politician who can get the job done. And we saw this, interestingly, even in the selection process that I mentioned earlier at the start of this interview, where the Conservative Party membership had to decide between Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. Now, they supported Liz Truss in terms of total numbers. But
Yeah.
this is a group of about 170,000 members who are predominantly white, if not 95% white, who are affluent, who live in certain parts of the UK. But and these would be the people one would have thought would be possibly, racist and would be against Rishi Sunak's candidacy. But he got 61,000 votes.
Yeah. Mm.
Just got 81, 82,000 votes. Of course, she
Mm.
won, but the margin of a win was
Yeah.
really, not that much. And in terms of numbers, and if one would have thought that this is a group that represents a traditional Britain that would be racist, etc., you suddenly
Mm-hmm.
realize that actually 60,000 of those people voted for him, and
Yeah.
only 20,000 more people voted for Liz
Would
Truss.
burn.
So I think that's important to bear in mind, that the difference was not as much as most people thought. They thought that
Mm.
actually that Rishi Sunak would be wiped out in this election process, by the
Mm.
Conservative Party members. But the reality is he was not. And to me, that represents more than anything else the aspect of racism in the UK, that actually maybe it isn't as much. Clearly, it is not as much as it was in the past, and institutional racism actually maybe very little in that sense, which is really why we see Rishi Sunak today as Britain's Prime Minister.
Followed that finance. Guess once this is sorted out, he will have outlived his utility and will be replaced by a white guy.
So, Surya, this plays to your question earlier,
Yeah.
and the point is that let's see what happens, which is my response again. Let's see
Yeah.
what happens if he's a spectacular success in the next year and a half. The Conservative Party may well say, "Listen, he's turned the country around. He's turned our
Yeah.
support around. Why are we going to dump him?" But remember, there are big beasts also, like Boris Johnson, who've done
Yeah.
this before, and
Mm.
remember, it will be an election. So there are all these factors, but I
Yeah.
would
Yeah.
say
Mm.
that it's not a given today, and we'll have to see what happens a year and a half later.
Mhm. Let's come to the India relationship now. Where do you see this going forward? The FTA has been delayed. It was supposed to have been signed in Diwali. Clearly, that's not happening. Where do you see the FTA going?
So I think the first point is that I would make a clear distinction between the British Indian community and the UK India relationship. Though they are linked, I mean, the British Indian community is seen as a living bridge between the UK and India, and it is that. But very often people sort of mistake it as sort of representing the entirety of the relationship between the UK and India, and it is not. It is strong in rhetoric, and in reality, it has certain influence, but not overwhelming influence. So my first point is that for the British Indian community at large, there is a view that Rishi Sunak's prime ministership will ensure that there are stronger relations with India, that he will move towards improving the substantive aspects of the relationship with India. The optics will improve, etc. My argument is that this is not likely to be the case.
Hmm. It's
That
not his job.
that he is the Prime Minister of Britain. He is not an Indian Prime Minister in the UK batting for improved relations between UK and India. So when we look at the more important dimension of the UK India bilateral relationship, it is complex. It is also we've seen over the years it has unfulfilled potential, and on certain areas like defense, it is an underperforming. So, what can Rishi Sunak actually
Yeah.
do, and what role does he have in this respect? I think the most important aspect will be the free trade agreement, the prospective free trade agreement that both countries expect to sign. From what Rishi Sunak has said in Parliament, and he said very little about India in Parliament, in all these
Yeah.
sort of 7 years that he's been in Parliament. He hasn't said anything negative about India, I think, in that respect, but he's not said anything positive either. He's not been one of the British Indian MPs pushing on the relationship with India. But
Hmm.
on the free trade agreement, he has talked very interestingly about a two-way relationship between the UK and India. British students going to India, that British Indian companies should have joint ventures, etc. Now, as part of this two-way relationship, possibly he will want the free trade agreement to be a substantive one, what I would call a
Hmm.
thick agreement that has all the sectors together and is not an interim agreement. Now, this
Mm-hmm.
will take some time to finalize. It'll happen most likely next year, if it happens at all. But I think it's likely to happen next year, not before that. And the FTA, when it is signed, it is done, signed, the deal is done. That is going to be the huge sort of, a plus point, the force multiplier for UK-India relations. So what I'm trying to say, it is not Rishi Sunak as a British Indian Prime Minister who is going to be the big force multiplier for UK-India relations. It is Rishi Sunak focusing on and getting the deal done of an FTA, which started with his predecessors, particularly Boris Johnson, in terms of India-UK comprehensive strategic partnership, Liz Truss, in terms of starting negotiations on the free trade agreement, but not Rishi Sunak as a British Indian Prime Minister. So I think that's the most important aspect of the two countries will be on a free trade agreement, getting it signed. The second and the final one, I would say, would be on defense and security issues. And this is whether he is
Something
a
wrong with the
strong
internet.
votary of improved defense ties between UK and India, we just don't know. But this will be again a key aspect of building the UK-India relationship, which is on defense and security. But my final point in this in this respect, Surya, will be that the UK elections are going to take place in a year and a half. It is very important for India to re-engage with the British Labour Party, in the next year and a half. There
Yeah.
have been some, sort of fractious sort of relations in the past with the Labour Party. But
Yeah.
the Indian government needs to engage with the British Labour Party, because it could well be that we will see a
Yeah.
Labour government in power a year and a half later, 2 years later. So I think, notwithstanding Rishi Sunak as a British Indian Prime Minister, it will be pragmatic for the Indian government to really re-engage the relation with the Labour Party in the event that it forms the next government in the UK.
Mhm. Would you say across the board, Conservative and Labour, there is a commitment towards improving ties with India, getting the trade thing going?
I would say that there is among the MPs who are interested in the UK-India relationship. If in terms of UK foreign policy, there are only three things that are most important for the UK: Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. I mean, the Russia-Ukraine war. That is the prime focus for the UK's foreign policy. So, with the economic crisis, that is the top priority for Rishi Sunak. The top foreign policy priority, the Russia-Ukraine war. How much space does that leave for relationships with other countries? With India particularly. Now, those MPs who are focused on the UK-India relationship, I think by and large are supportive, of a UK-India free trade agreement. I would think that is the sense. But there is another new aspect that could well emerge, which is the China factor. And I say that because Rishi Sunak has been quite tough on China. I mean, in his campaign over summer for the leadership role, he talked about China as not only a national security threat, but an economic threat as well.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if the UK's review of its integrated review, which will come out in the next few weeks, has a much tougher position in relation to China, then that provides opportunities that we've not seen before to actually improve the UK India perspectives on China and build a consensus between the two countries on China to further their relationship, which, as I said, we've not seen before.
Fascinating, Rahul, fascinating. We'll be interested to see how things pan out over the course of the next year and a half. Very interesting.
Yes.
Rahul, we are at the end of our time. Thanks very much for gracing this conversation. A lot of insight there and perspective. And looking forward to more such conversations. Let's hope Rishi Sunak does what the people of England expect him to.
That's right. Yes, and we'll see what happens. But as I said, competent prime minister.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Rahul Roy Chaudhary, thank you very much. Glad to have you.
Thank you.
And for those of you who joined us on this conversation, do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Follow us on social media, Twitter, Instagram. Thank you and good night.